Okay, let's get started with topic 4, manufacturing in the long 19th century. We're not going to be able to cover what we would have covered in class if we were meeting and could interact and I could really teach you something, but I'm going to try and introduce you to the highlights so you can make sense of these notes. These notes we're referring to here are on our page, the manufacturing page. You can click on those if you want, maybe print them off, highlighted or something like that. But maybe just want to wait and see what you make of this. All right, so I've got the notes up here in a form that might be useful. Starting with the question, what are tariffs? You say, tariffs are a tax on imports. Excellent. Think about how historically tariffs were the easiest tax to collect because ships came into harbors. Back to water transport, remember that? Think about Hamilton versus Jefferson. Hamilton wanting the tariff for revenue and to protect infant industry to promote industrial urban development. Jefferson, no thanks to cities, no thanks to factories, and Jefferson says, let's have a weak federal government. Maybe because he doesn't want a government that could interfere with slavery and slave property rights. But in any case, pretty straightforward, you might say. Except, does it make sense to say that Hamilton would support tariffs for both revenue and protection? Think about that for a minute, and let's hit a small supply and demand model to show what we're thinking. Well, let's not do supply and demand yet. Just tell me what you think the graph is going to look like that shows tariff revenue in relation to a tariff rate. 0 tariff rate, 0 tariff revenue. And so you think, oh yeah, there's going to be this increase in revenue as the tariff rate increases. But what happens when this tariff rate is very high? Tariff rate very high, and no one's going to import anything revenue of 0. So let's graph what we'd expect the relationship to be. So we're going to get some sort of a simple parabola. What I need you to recognize is that when tariffs are not too high, then as you increase the tariff, revenue is going to increase, collecting more per unit, and the number of units doesn't fall too much. But once tariffs get too high, then we have increasing protection causing a decrease in revenue. Think that through and it should become obvious. Okay, I hope it's obvious here. Increase the tariff rate and you get more revenue, and the higher the rate, the more you're protecting the industry at home. You're raising prices for the goods so that the domestic suppliers get paid more for it. But notice if the rate goes too high, then revenue and protection conflict with each other. Try and think about that logically, and you'll recognize, yeah, if tariff rates are lowish, then revenue and protection are compatible goals. But when you start to get highly protective tariffs, you're trading off, and you have to choose. Do you want protection or do you want revenue? So be careful not to fall into the trap of thinking that revenue and protection always go together. Simple point connected to things like taxing cigarettes. You've probably heard people say, hey, let's tax cigarettes. We'll get lots of revenue for the government to build roads and run hospitals, and it'll also prevent people from smoking. But of course, if you are successful in deterring smoking, then those are tax revenues not being collected. All right, let's do that arithmetically. Okay, simple example. Suppose we're talking about a tariff on shirts. The shirts are available from the rest of the world. Notice that abbreviation ROW, rest of the world, for $50 each. We'll model that later, but for now, let's have a $5 tariff. Suppose that imports would then be 100,000 shirts per year for a revenue of, do the math, $500,000. Now, what if we raise the tariff to, say, $6? maybe then the imports drop, but they only drop to say 90,000 per year. Do the math, 540,000. All right, there we go. Revenues increase from 500,000 to 540,000 as the tariff goes up from $5 to $6. So what about the protection to domestic shirt makers? In what sense is that increased? Well, hope that's obvious. Write it down. But when tariffs are high, revenue and protection are conflicting goals. So, for example, let's suppose there's a $15 tariff with imports of 40,000 shirts for revenue of 60,000. What about a $16 tariff? Following the pattern, there'd only be 30,000 shirts imported for a revenue of 4,800. Simple point, keep it in mind. Next. Okay, there's your first bit of economics. Back to the history of it. From 1780 to 1860, the tariff was intertwined with the issue of slavery. There's some discussion of that here. The thing to think about here is whether it makes sense to view the tariff as a northern policy and anti-tariff as a southern policy. Simple point I hope we've talked about before. Sometimes we want to think slavery and freedom, south, north. But sometimes agriculture versus industry makes more sense. So although there's no disputing that tariffs were tied up with north-south issues and issues of slavery and abolition, still, as a factual matter, the Midwest was agricultural and the South were agricultural, and from a point of view of interests, it's really the Northeast against the rest of the country. So you need to look to the politics to figure out how it was that a fairly small and influential group in the Northeast were able to get tariffs put in place that broadly hurt so many people. Anyhow, the point is, for our purposes, you might want to be aware of and look into the 1828 Tariff of Abominations. It brought rates up to 50% or more, generating lots of opposition, especially in the South. Most famously, Senator J.C. Calhoun and the governor, whoever it was at the time, almost started a civil war in 1832 in response to the 1828 tariff. But there's a compromise in 1832 avoiding a civil war, putting that off until 1860. And a slow compromise unfolds, bringing the tariffs down from about 50% in 1828 to about 20% in 1860. And then once the South secedes and the Republicans are in charge of Congress, they boost tariffs up to 50%, where they stay until the 1920s. So, for you historians, look into the tariff with reference to North-South conflict and the coming of the Civil War. For economists, two things. There is two things we're going to focus on. Notice here we're going to talk about supply and demand of a tariff, and then we're going to talk about the debate about whether tariffs had a role in the U.S. Industrial Revolution. Before we get to those interesting things, we'll finish with a little comment on what I describe as lots of boring and inconclusive research on who actually was hurt or helped by tariffs and how much they might have been helped or hurt. If you're interested, you can think in terms of what we call factorial income effects, factors of production, labor, capital, land. What sort of labor? What sort of land? What sort of capital? Whose incomes, what sort of incomes were increased or decreased by tariffs? So you're thinking, for example, oh yeah, put a tariff on shirts and shirt makers make more money. But who are shirt makers? Yeah, people who own shirt factories. But economics question, to what extent do higher prices for shirts translate into higher wages for the people who work in shirt factories? Answer is not necessarily at all, because so many different people can work in shirt factories. Unlikely to have a big impact on labor markets generally. But as you can see, that gets pretty boring pretty quickly. The other point to think about is what are the regional consequences of tariffs. Here, pretty simple. South and Midwest are going to end up paying more for goods that they're importing. The Northeast is also going to pay more for the goods they import, but they also produce those goods, so some people in the Northeast will be gaining income. So possibly the Northeast is going to be making money off of the South and the Midwest, but really what's going on there is simply manufacturing incomes going up at the cost of agricultural incomes. Okay, that's it for now. We'll be back shortly with another video on the supply and demand analysis of a tariff. Bye for now.